Hi, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well and keeping safe during these dire times. Um, Here's something to celebrate. We are going over the last chapter in the textbook, which means we are officially at the end of the semester, almost, right? Besides assignments that you have to turn in. But this is the last political institution we're going to be looking at, the judiciary. It is Article 3 of the Constitution. And arguably, not arguably, it actually is it is the most popular political institution currently. If you look at public opinion polls, the presidency, Congress are both political institutions in which we elect our leaders. And they currently have about a 20 to 25% approval rating in terms of the institution itself. The judiciary, the Supreme Court, on the other hand, has a 57% approval rating. The only political institution which we don't elect the folks on the court, right? And so let's get to brass tacks. Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution states, judicial power, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. It's important to distinguish that the founders created the Supreme Court and left the power for Congress to create lower courts. In other words, the founders believed that one court for the whole country, 13 colonies, was enough at the founding, but knew that with the growth of the country that other courts would have to be created, and that they left that responsibility up to Congress. They left the responsibility to Congress to create the courts, but left the responsibility with the president with Senate approval for judiciary picks. Right? So in other words, for now, President Trump gets to choose all if there's any vacancies on the courts. He gets to choose people to fill those seats, and then the Senate has to approve. Judges serve good behavior. In other words, they have a life term. This term good behavior is in the Constitution. It's fairly vague, though. And once you're appointed, your salary is never compromised. You are protected. You are there for life. And so President Trump, smart with a smart mind, is a lot of his picks are young folks, young conservative judges, because they can be on the courts for 30, 40, maybe even 50 years with good health, right? And so the question to you, of course, if we were in a physical classroom, we could spend a few minutes talking about this. Is this democratic? Right? In other words, what do you think the founders had good intentions for giving the president the responsibility to choose who's on the federal courts, and that they're there for life, that there's no term limit, and that they offer this vague term, good behavior, when in reality, very little or not many at all federal judges have been removed from the courts. Essentially, they're there for life. So this doesn't sound very democratic to me. What could a good alternative be? Could we elect judges? And some county and local judges are elected. And there are issues with that as well. If you watch John Oliver's segment on judges, he goes over that very in-depthly. Okay, so there's that. I'm going to go over the bare minimum for this chapter, because a lot of what I want you to focus on this week is in the articles by Chris Wolf and Ryan Weissman. I'll go over that at the end of the PowerPoint, the sections I want you to go over for those readings. So this slide actually, in a way, spells out a lot of what we're going to be going over this week and what I want you to take away from this chapter. The development of the federal courts, there's the founders' view and there's what the court has turned into. the founders did not expect courts to play a significant role in public policy, right? Courts are supposed to apply existing law, right? And there's this term, judicial activism, which we'll be using fairly often. This notion of judicial activism, which turns the court into a lawmaking body, essentially, comes along when judges don't merely question the law, but make law instead. So the simplest way I could put this is what the founders wanted the courts to just apply existing law and settle any disputes between federal and state laws. So in other words, if the Congress or a particular state passed a law that was unconstitutional, all the Supreme Court's job is to say, this law is unconstitutional for reasons X, Y, and Z. Throw the ball back to Congress or that state, telling them, you have to fix this. This is unconstitutional because of this, this, and this. Right? Because judges have to know how to apply existing law by being able to determine why a particular law is unconstitutional, and give the ball back to that state or Congress to fix their mistake, fix their unconstitutional mistake. But what judicial activist judges have now done is to say, okay, this is unconstitutional, therefore our ruling will essentially create new law, right? So the biggest example many people think of is Roe versus Wade, which is a case I want you to know for your exam, right? Roe versus Wade didn't just say that bans, a state ban on an abortion procedure is unconstitutional, right? It said that, but it went further by then doubling down and saying, okay, you can't just ban access to abortion. You must allow abortion, right? And that's what Roe versus Wade did. It was judicial activism on steroids, basically, by saying, states cannot ban access to abortions, but now access to abortion has to be allowed across all 50 states, right? And you see this with a number of cases, with a number of public policy issues. So I want you to think about, what are some Supreme Court cases that you know of that have gone the extra mile, not just say the law is unconstitutional, but then created law, right? I can think of Obergefell versus Hodges with the gay marriage case, right? Not only did it say, right, that state bans on same-sex marriage are unconstitutional, but now all 50 states must allow same-sex marriage couples to get married, to grant them licenses, right? So do you see how it's evolved from judicial restraint, which is what the founders argued by saying just apply existing law. We've gone from a court that practiced judicial restraint to a court that practices judicial activism, that goes further, doubles down and says, okay, this is now existing law. And so Alexander Hamilton, Federalist 78, argued that the least dangerous branch of government was the judiciary. And he says this under the notion of the court that they had, that the court would practice judicial restraint. So now many scholars and many students in political science would argue against Alexander Hamilton, that the court has become overwhelmingly more powerful than the Congress and the presidency, and is now arguably the most dangerous branch of government because of all the power that's accumulated. But that's subjective. That's an opinion that I want you to be able to articulate, and you will be able to articulate it in your discussion forum posts this week. Okay, so there are three major periods for the federal courts in this country. The first 80 years or so, the founding, or the Constitution that we live with, is 1787 to 1865. It's when we were developing ourselves as a nation and building the legitimacy of the federal government, and dealing with slavery, right? So you remember those cases, Supreme Court cases with the cartoons I showed you in chapter 3. Those cases, right, McCulloch v. Maryland, Gibbons v. Ogden, established the fact, the courts established that the federal government has supremacy over states, right? And so this era, this first quote unquote era of the federal courts, established that yes, the federal government is more powerful than states. The next era is 1865, after the Civil War, to 1937, right through the New Deal and the Great Depression, really establishes or really questions the relationship between the government and the economy. Right? In other words, during times of crisis, right, does the federal government have the power to exert itself to help those in need? And the answer is yes, right? And we're seeing it today as we live through COVID-19, right? COVID-19 will be remembered as the Second Great Depression, right? In other words, if you haven't realized this, and I don't think I've mentioned this earlier, which I probably should have, 22 million people applied for unemployment in the last 3 weeks, right? And the numbers usually come in on Wednesdays, and today's Monday. So we'll probably see that probably closer to 30 million people have lost their jobs in the past month. It's incredible. It's a huge number, right? And so we are living through another national crisis right now. And the question is, what is the role of the federal government in mitigating this national crisis, right? And so from 1865 to right after the Civil War, right, notions of slavery, right, were also in question, right? The slaves were free. What do we do now? How do we get around it? And a lot of people did that with sharecropping and other ways to exploit freed slaves and other African Americans, right? So this era really solidified the notion that the federal government has the power to intervene and mitigate in times of emergency. Now, the last 80 years or so, the current era that we're living in, really deal with the question of personal liberty and social inequality, right? And most notably, you have the civil rights movement. You have education funding. Actually, education funding is a huge issue that deals with social inequality, right? Because notably, in this country, states deal with education funding, right? But again, if you live in a state that it doesn't have the revenue necessary or sufficient to deal with modern educational problems, you need the federal government to assist. And so the last 30 or 40 years especially, we've been seeing states advocate for more federal funding or assistance with education. But certainly civil rights and gay rights, and more notably, more recently, transgender rights, right? These are all issues of personal liberties and civil rights that the courts are being left to decide what is the fate, what is the fate of these issues. So just to recap, the founders' view of the Supreme Court was fairly limited with judicial restraint. What the court has evolved into today is widely impactful, definitely more powerful, and deals with judicial activism. Okay, and so the sort of second era, right, with FDR and the New Deal, right? FDR, President Roosevelt, wanted to pack the courts. And we're seeing this, we kind of heard Democrats talk about this late last year with this upcoming election. But court packing would not be a good idea, right? Court packing is adding more justices to the Supreme Court. And people want to do that so their agenda or their political ideology will prevail in the court. And it's if we started to do that, it would be a slippery slope, because Now, what happens if you pack the court with your people, and then 8 years later, the other side wins, and they pack the court even more with their folks, right? We would be turning the Supreme Court ultimately into another Congress, right? The fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court is supposed to be an institution that applies existing law, that states whether or not this law is unconstitutional or not, and should give the ball back to the legislature to come up with a constitutional replacement, right? This isn't happening, right? We're seeing judicial activism more and more take over our court system, and so the question for us now, one, can either be, how do we stop this? How do we go back to a court of judicial restraint? But also, the question I would ask, and I'm going to pose to you, is why is this happening, right? And I would argue it's because our Congress hasn't been properly representative of the American people. In other words, our Congress, our leaders don't advocate for the issues that we care about. Therefore, we are left to the Supreme Court to deal with these issues, right? So 2 issues I brought up, abortion and gay rights. If the Supreme Court didn't intervene, do you think Congress or any president would have signed a law or an executive order saying abortion is now a guaranteed constitutional right, or gay marriage is now a constitutional right for homosexual couples? No, I don't think so. I tend to be pessimistic about these things. It took the Supreme Court to be that institution to solve issues and delegate and have these delegated responsibilities from the Congress and the presidency, because the president and the Congress have not been fairly representative of what the American people want today. And I think that the argument I'm making is proven by public opinion polls. More people trust the Supreme Court today than they do Congress and the presidency. So that's unusual. So court packing with FDR, it didn't work. Thank God it didn't work, right? It would have just been a long, slippery slope. The Warren Court, Justice Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was the Chief Justice for 16 years. And in that 16-year period, it was a very activist court, right? It ended segregation in schools. Brown v. Board of Education. Thank you, Supreme Court. Right? It ended mandates for there to be school prayer in our public schools, right? Thank you, Supreme Court. So the Warren Court, you hear conservatives, they scream and yell about the Supreme Court, right? But at the end of the day, right, segregation in schools, mandated school prayer in our public schools, these things were ended. These issues were fixed by the Supreme Court. They weren't fixed by Congress. They weren't fixed by the president. So that's something you really have to think about, right? And so in the last 25, 30 years or so, there's been this revival of state sovereignty, states wanting to have more rights than the federal government, right? And the main case that we look at is NFIB v. Sebelius, which was a big Obamacare case that said it's constitutional to tax people if they don't purchase health insurance, but it's unconstitutional to force or mandate state governments to expand Medicaid. Right? Personally, my opinion is why would a state not want to expand healthcare coverage for its poor folks, for low-income people? But again, under our beautiful system of federalism in the Constitution, right, the court determined it was unconstitutional to force states to expand Medicaid. Let them do it on their own. Cannot force them to do it. Right? This slide isn't particularly important for our week of discussion forums, but I think it's valuable. When you select a judge, right, there are 2 things you have to think about. Party background, right? Because unfortunately, your partisanship will affect how you interpret the law. And believe me, Trump and any other president knows this, right? is the judge a Republican? Is the judge a Democrat? Right? You assume they're going to interpret the law differently based on their political ideology. And senatorial courtesy. Remember, the Senate is the one that approves judicial picks. So judges that are approved should be liked by the senators from that state. There should be some, they call it senatorial courtesy. I think that's the best way to describe it. But there should be some sort of relationship between that judge and particular senators from that state where they're from, right? The litmus test, right? So there's different district courts in the country. The 5th district is more conservative in the Midwest. The 9th district is more liberal because it's on the West Coast, right? Is the judge compatible to be on that district court? What is their ideology? What is their past history? All these things will come up at that Senate hearing for that judge. Okay, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Checks on judicial power. Congress has checks on judicial power. The Senate has the power to confirm judges and impeach judges, right? And Congress is the one that chooses the number of judges on our courts, right? So in 1978, Congress passed a bill that created 152 new federal district and appellate judges to help ease the workload of the federal judiciary, right? So remember, the founders created the Supreme Court, that #1 court on top. Congress has to create lower courts so the top court doesn't have as much of a workload, right? Because lower courts can make, impactful decisions. This bill gave President Carter a chance to appoint over 40% of the federal judiciary, right? Because Carter was president at the time. In 1984, Congress created 84 more judgeships, and that gave Reagan the power to appoint judges, right? And so 4 years later, President Reagan had the power to appoint over half of judges in the country, half of federal judges in the country, right? So think about that in the past, and now in the present, Mitch McConnell is Senate Majority Leader, right? He's lowered the debate time from 30 hours to 2 hours on going over judicial picks. This means, right, the Senate can confirm all of Trump's judicial picks. And Trump has already appointed a record number of judges in this country. They will be on the court for the rest of their lives, right? It's a little scary. This is a cool image. It just shows the 9 justices on the court and how long they've been on the court, right? So Clarence Thomas has been on the court for 29 years. He's the longest serving judge. Ginsburg, 27, Breyer, 26, right? And so you can see most presidents get 2 picks, right? In 8 years of their presidency, right? Trump already has 2 in in his first 2 years, he had 2 picks. So if Trump gets reelected, he could get several more seats on the Supreme Court, which would be record-breaking, right? Public opinion and the courts is another check on judicial power. It restrains and energizes. And most notably from the 1800s was the Dred Scott case, right? This infuriated the North and was widely ignored, right? It stated that if you took a slave to an area where the term is slipping my mind. If you took a slave to a free area that slavery was illegal, that slave could be sent back to a slave state. That slave didn't have rights outside of that slave state. So obviously this infuriated a lot of people who were dead against slavery, right? And so activism coincides with political change, right? Yes, this decision was made, but if you look at the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman and all sorts of other, instances of activism that helped African Americans gain their rights and their self-dignity. It took time, right? But it took from I'm losing the case from took 60 years from the case in 1898 to Brown versus Board of Education, where segregation in schools was not allowed, right? And so remember, activism, what happens on the outside has an impact on how the judges will interpret that case, right? So this is the more juicy stuff, right? Judicial review is the power of courts to declare laws unconstitutional. So judicial restraint, we talked about earlier, that's an originalist approach. Judicial activism is a living constitutional approach, right? And so if you're still haven't done a response paper yet, there are 2 articles on the judiciary, right? Antonin Scalia on originalism, right? That's 1 article. And then Stephen Breyer on the living constitution, that's another article. Those are two Supreme Court justices, and they talk about their judicial philosophies, right? The 2 approaches are not parallel to liberal and conservative political ideologies. Right? Some people, people assume that if you are a certain political party, you will interpret a law a certain way. Presidents do this as well, but it's not always parallel, right? So here are 2 instances. Justice Hugo Black, a liberal, right, once voted to uphold a state law banning birth control because nothing in the Constitution prohibited such a law, right? So he was liberal, but he voted to uphold that state law because nothing in the Constitution prohibited such a law. In other words, the founders didn't talk about birth control, but that's why he ruled that way, because the founders, there's nothing in the Constitution about birth control, right? Another instance, Justice Rufus Peckham, a conservative, once voted to overturn a state law setting the maximum hours of work because he believed the 14th Amendment guaranteed something called freedom of contract, even though those words are not in the amendment, right? So in other words, he interpreted the 14th Amendment to guarantee freedom of contract, right? That terminology is not in the 14th Amendment, but because of the circumstances of the case and how he interpreted the 14th Amendment, that's how he voted on the case, right? Judicial activism, right? Supporters of it argue that the federal courts must correct injustices when the other branches of government fail to do so, right? So again, like I mentioned at the beginning, the Supreme Court is the institution of last resort, right? For those without the votes or the influence to obtain new laws, and especially for the poor and powerless, right? Because after all, Congress and state legislatures allowed public segregation in public schools to go on for decades. They let that happen. It was the Supreme Court that had to step in and say, bro, this is unconstitutional, right? So it is the institution of last resort, and if you're poor or powerless, it is your institution to depend on because Congress and the president haven't acted, right? So that's supporters of judicial activism. Critics of judicial activism say, judges have no special expertise, they're lawyers in defining rights, but not in designing and managing complex institutions. They are unelected, they are immune to popular control. And so in other words, people that are not in favor of judicial activism say, you need experts to really be able to vote and rule on complicated issues. Okay, so there are 4 sections in the Wiseman article that I want you to go over, right? So it's not a lot of this paper. It just is probably half or less than half the paper. Judicial review, modern constitutional interpretation, features of modern judicial review, and the conclusion. 4 sections in the Wiseman, in the Wolf article. And then the examples of judicial activism, that's a whole other article. Right? it's not really, it's not an academic article, but it does a good job of listing examples of judicial activism and why it's been a benefit, right? So again, I want you to keep in mind, how has judicial review affected our political system? Has judicial review, judicial activism been beneficial or pervasive to our political system, and why? Right? So I'm not going to go over this in too much detail. You have the PowerPoint. But the Wiseman article looks at education, abortion, and gay marriage as three areas of public policy and how judicial activism was a benefit. Right? The first section in the Wolf article goes over Federalist 78 and Marbury versus Madison. How these two, this paper and Supreme Court case, allow flows from reasoning. It shows the flows of reasoning of why we have a written constitution. And today, the controversy with the courts today is over scope and use of power. Is it undemocratic, right? Because judicial review is the popular will of the people in the judiciary. More transient popular will is in the legislature and Congress, right? So the check the courts have is that Congress can impeach, right? And so do we have a system of judicial supremacy today? Is the court too powerful today? That's a question we have to ask ourselves, right? And ask yourselves while looking at the Wiseman article, right? If the Supreme Court didn't practice judicial activism, these cases wouldn't have been founded the way they were. And if they weren't founded the way they were, what would the impact be on our political system today? Would we still be fighting for education funding, which we are? Would we still be fighting for abortion rights, which we are? Would we still be fighting for gay marriage rights? Not when we have gay marriage rights, but certainly there's still discrimination against gay couples and gay people in general, right? So modern constitutional interpretation, this is the second section. Judges are concerned less with interpretation in the strict sense of the term, rather than specifying the application of vague constitutional generalities. So in other words, what judges do today is they evaluate the importance of the asserted right, the importance of state interest and said to justify impinging on that particular right, and whether the state interests justify such an impingement upon the right as the case involved. Right? So you see the judges are going a step further than just evaluating the constitutionality of the law, right? They're looking at what impact it'll have on the state or the country as a whole, right? Which is not what the founders viewed, right? Features of modern judicial review and the conclusion, right? So traditional judicial review tried to maintain its democratic credentials by arguing that judges were not enforcing their own rules, but simply the will of the people contained in the Constitution, right? But with the development of this new judicial review, right, that it's consciously legislative in character. I like that terminology. So it acts like a Congress in character, right? The old defense is no longer available, right? And that modern judicial review is precisely the process of giving meaning to open-ended generalities in the Constitution, right? So in other words, if there's a clause or an amendment in the Constitution that can be interpreted differently, judges are now doing that. And they're applying it to their rulings, not Congress, which they should be doing and making new laws. So that's just a quick little review of the reading, right? You did a really good job last week with Pistrito, and so I think Wolf and Pistrito are about the same level of difficulty in reading. This is graduate level reading, so I'm proud of you guys for being able to take a stab at it in terms of understanding these complex meanings. But again, the theme of these past few weeks or month or so has been what was the founders' view and conception of these political institutions, and how they evolved throughout our country's history, and what are the political and constitutional implications of that. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys have a great week. I look forward to reading your posts. Office hours are on Thursday afternoons on Zoom. Please email me if you have any questions, okay? Take care, everybody.